The story began with a psychiatrist speaking at a conference, concluding his talk by reminding the audience of Socrates' wisdom that before one can understand others, they must first know themselves. Meanwhile, Spider-Man was searching for the psychiatrist, believing he had finally found the one man who might be able to help him. As the psychiatrist drove back to his office, he reflected happily on his career, thinking about how much he enjoyed bringing self-knowledge to others and how profitable it was. Spider-Man watched him leave and noted that he was heading back to his office. Spider-Man was relieved, knowing it was late and the psychiatrist likely would not have any patience at this hour. Once back at his office, the psychiatrist relaxed alone, watching cartoons on TV. Suddenly, he noticed Spider-Man's shadow cast across his window and, in surprise, shouted out Spider-Man's name. Spider-Man began climbing through the window, reassuring the psychiatrist that everything was fine and apologizing for interrupting what he jokingly guessed must be a scholarly program with lots of important note-taking. The psychiatrist quickly turned off the TV and replied that he needed to stay updated on the latest trends in psychiatry, but he would record the show for later. Curious, he asked Spider-Man what he could do for him. Spider-Man explained that he was having an identity crisis, and it seemed to be getting worse. The psychiatrist immediately imagined the fame he could gain from curing Spider-Man, already picturing headlines celebrating his success. Smiling to himself, he said he would be happy to help, and gestured for Spider-Man to get comfortable and tell him everything. Instead of lying on the couch, Spider-Man stuck to the ceiling and laid down there. The psychiatrist, slightly thrown off but still professional, said it was not quite what he had in mind, but assured Spider-Man he was listening. Spider-Man began explaining that he felt like he was not in control of his own life. As he spoke, the psychiatrist started jotting down notes, only to suddenly realize he had forgotten to ask if Spider-Man had insurance. Setting the thought aside, he asked Spider-Man to explain what he meant. Spider-Man pointed out that most people, like the psychiatrist himself, remained fundamentally the same over time, whereas he felt he kept changing. When the psychiatrist confirmed that he was still the same man he had been months or years ago, Spider-Man admitted that he was not. The psychiatrist, puzzled, glanced at his reflection in the mirror and thought to himself that Spider-Man would need a lot of therapy, enough that he could finally afford that new Bentley. He imagined his reputation soaring as the psychiatrist to the stars. Meanwhile, Spider-Man confessed that his real problem was that he wasn't sure who the real him even was. Curious and a little overwhelmed, the psychiatrist asked how many versions of him there were, to which Spider-Man replied that it was hard to explain. Spider-Man stretched out his arms and asked the psychiatrist how many arms he had. The psychiatrist answered that he had 2, just as anyone would. Spider-Man agreed that was what he always thought too, until something strange happened a few years ago. Without warning, the psychiatrist watched in shock as Spider-Man suddenly sprouted 6 arms. Overwhelmed by the sight, the psychiatrist stammered out his amazement and asked how it was even possible. Spider-Man simply replied that it was a long story. Desperate to record everything, the psychiatrist frantically scribbled notes and urged Spider-Man to tell him more. Calmly, Spider-Man placed one of his many arms on the psychiatrist's shoulder and advised him to relax, promising that there was still a lot more to the story. Spider-Man then explained that just when he had gotten used to his usual red and blue costume, he found himself wearing something entirely different: a black Venom suit. Spider-Man admitted that his transformation was incredibly confusing for a superhero. The psychiatrist, trying to lighten the mood, remarked that the suit did slim him down. As they spoke, Spider-Man's suit started tearing apart, and the psychiatrist, now even more bewildered, asked what was happening. Spider-Man, growing larger, warned the psychiatrist that this was just the beginning. In an instant, he hulked out, becoming massive and monstrous. He challenged the psychiatrist, asking him to imagine looking in a mirror and seeing such a terrifying sight. The psychiatrist, now completely stunned, called him a Spider Hulk. Convinced he was the victim of an elaborate prank, he slammed down his notepad and pen, accusing some special effects crew of pulling a trick on him and scolding himself for not catching on sooner. Spider-Man, still in his Hulk form, grabbed the psychiatrist by the shirt, lifting him up to his face and demanding whether he saw any cameras or blue screens. Realizing the truth, the psychiatrist stuttered, asking if this was really happening. Spider-Man threw him onto the office couch and joked that if he didn't believe it, maybe he ought to see a psychiatrist himself. Before the psychiatrist could gather his thoughts, Spider-Man suddenly vanished from sight. Confused and terrified, the psychiatrist shouted into the empty room, wondering how something so large could just disappear. He started panicking, convinced he had lost his mind, mourning his own sanity as a tragic loss for humanity. Then, a tiny voice near his shoe warned him to watch where he stepped. Looking down, the psychiatrist realized Spider-Man had shrunk to the size of an insect. Spider-Man called up from the floor, explaining that he had once shrunk down to Ant-Man's size while traveling to the microverse. The psychiatrist, now completely unraveling, muttered that he was hearing voices and imagined bugs were talking to him. Spider-Man, realizing his tiny size wasn't helping, decided to act fast before he got crushed. Suddenly, a new voice echoed from above. The psychiatrist could only manage a gurgled noise of shock when he looked up. Spider-Man had transformed again, this time into a giant lizard. Teasing the psychiatrist, he expressed surprise that the man could still be shocked after everything he had seen. Before the psychiatrist could react, Spider-Man mutated once more, becoming a massive spider, looming over him, and asking if he was more frightened by this form. As the psychiatrist stumbled backwards, overwhelmed, Spider-Man casually asked if he's still charged by the hour, even when he wasn't paying attention. The overwhelmed psychiatrist fainted, and when he came to, he found himself being gently woken up by yet another version of Spider-Man, this time appearing as a pig, who oinked cheerfully and urged him to wake up, claiming he was missing some of the best parts. Spider-Man, now back to his normal appearance, sat down beside the psychiatrist with a notepad and pen in hand. He tried to comfort the shaken doctor, assuring him that everything would be okay and that he was there for him. The psychiatrist pulled himself together, and after considering everything he had witnessed, concluded that Spider-Man was likely experiencing an identity crisis. Spider-Man responded with sarcastic enthusiasm, impressed by how the psychiatrist earned his reputation and income. The psychiatrist then suggested that much of what Spider-Man was describing might only be a product of his imagination. Spider-Man, frustrated by the suggestion, insisted that if the psychiatrist thought this was wild, he should hear the rest. He explained that even after the Green Goblin had died, he still found himself fighting him again, which understandably made him question his reality. He continued mentioning how his Aunt May was constantly on the verge of death, and even recalled a time when she actually did die, only for it not to be permanent. Hearing this, the psychiatrist suspiciously asked if Spider-Man had been drinking. Spider-Man, ignoring the question, shifted the conversation to Mary Jane, referring to her as MJ, leaving the psychiatrist confused and asking what an MJ was. Spider-Man then threw a handful of photographs at the psychiatrist, pictures of him and Mary Jane spanning their complicated relationship, each one showing different moments from his relationship with Mary Jane. He described how they were first friends, then married, then separated, and how at one point she was pregnant, only for that to be reversed. As the psychiatrist stared at the pile of photos, completely overwhelmed, he couldn't help but feel broken down. Spider-Man, noticing the psychiatrist's silence, asked if he was even listening, but the psychiatrist, barely holding it together, suddenly rushed out of the office, shouting that he had an emergency to attend to. Watching him flee, Spider-Man could only mutter in frustration about how little help the psychiatrist had turned out to be. Now, it was the psychiatrist who needed therapy. Drenched in sweat and looking completely shattered, he found himself sitting across from his own psychiatrist, who gently urged him to calm down and start from the beginning. Barely holding himself together, the exhausted doctor could only whisper that it all started when Spider-Man first came into his office. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.